This happened back in the summer of 1999, and my best friend Eric and I were doing what we always did, riding our bikes around town until sunset. That night, we decided to hit up Blockbuster to rent a couple of video games for his PlayStation. It was the highlight of the week back then. Renting games and staying up all night gaming. The ride to the store was uneventful. We got to Blockbuster, and after about 20 minutes of arguing, we settled on Twisted Metal 3 and Silent Hill. We pooled our money, paid for the rentals, and stuffed the cases into Eric's backpack before hopping back on our bikes. As we turned onto a quiet stretch near the park, I noticed two figures on bikes coming toward us from the other end of the street. They were older, probably in high school, and as they got closer, we knew something was up. They weren't just riding, they were aiming straight for us. They yelled out to us to stop. They skidded their bikes to block the road ahead. Eric and I exchanged a glance, but didn't stop. We tried to ride around them, but the taller one, wearing a black hoodie, grabbed Eric's handlebars, forcing him to stop. The other kid, stockier and dressed in a flannel shirt, stepped in front of me. They asked where we were going and what we were carrying in the backpack. Eric said nothing and tried pulling his bike away. They said, "Don't lie, or we're gonna kick your ass. We saw you guys leaving Blockbuster." They asked again, and I said nothing. I told them to leave us alone. Before I could react, one of them punched me in the stomach, knocking the wind out of me. I stumbled off my bike, holding my stomach, while the other kid pushed Eric to the ground. The backpack slipped off his shoulders, and the two older kids grabbed it, yanking out the games. Eric tried to stand up, but the kid kicked his bike, sending it crashing down on top of him. Then they turned their attention to me. They stomped on my front rim, bending it out of shape, and slashed Eric's rear tire with a pocket knife. "Thanks for the games," they said, while tossing the empty backpack at Eric's face before pedaling off. They laughed as they sped away. Eric and I sat there for a moment, too stunned to move. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking. The pain in my stomach was sharp, but the humiliation hurt worse. We pushed our ruined bikes home in silence, the only sound the squeak of bent wheels. When we got to my house, my mom freaked out when she saw us. She cleaned up Eric's scraped elbow and made us tell her everything. My dad wanted to call the police, but Eric and I begged him not to. We didn't want to make things worse. By the time Eric's dad came to pick him up, we were both trying to laugh it off. We made plans to hang out the next day, and he went home with his dad. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the whole thing replay over and over in my head. Around midnight, I decided to grab some water. As I passed by the window in the living room, I glanced outside. I froze. There, in the middle of the street, were two kids just riding their bikes in circles under the streetlight. I ran to my parents' room. I shook my dad awake, telling him they were outside. He grabbed a baseball bat and stormed out the front door, but when he got there, the street was empty. No bikes, no kids, nothing. He told me I was just spooked and said I needed to go back to bed. The next day, Eric came over and my parents drive us to Blockbuster. The staff was understanding and said, as long as we provided a police report, then my parents didn't have to pay for the games. My dad ended up filing a report that afternoon. We never saw those kids again. They must have been from another area. I had just gotten my license, probably around 1995. The freedom was nice, but it came with responsibilities, like returning overdue movies to Blockbuster. It was a little before midnight, and I had to get the tapes into the Dropbox to avoid a late fee. The streets were quiet as I headed out. The Blockbuster parking lot was practically deserted. The only other car in the lot was parked toward the back. It was an old sedan. Inside, I noticed a couple. At first, it didn't seem out of the ordinary, just two people sitting in their car. But as I got out of mine to drop the movies off, I caught the girl's eyes in my peripheral vision. She was staring at me, not just staring, frantically glancing like she wanted to say something but couldn't. I hesitated at the drop box, the tapes in my hand. My gut told me something was off. The girl rolled down her window slightly and called out to me. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were telling a different story. She said they were out of gas and asked if I had any spare change. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Her tone didn't match her expression. Her eyes darted toward the guy in the driver's seat who sat still. Every instinct I had screamed at me to walk away, so I shook my head and said, "No, sorry," before quickly getting back into my car. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The sedan's headlights flicked on. They started following me. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they really were low on gas and heading to a station. But when I made a random right turn and they followed, my chest tightened. I took another right and then another. 3 turns in, and they were still behind me. By the 4th turn, it was clear. They weren't going anywhere. I didn't have a cell phone. Back then, most people didn't. My mind raced through my options. I couldn't go home. I didn't want them knowing where I lived. Instead, I decided to head toward the main road, where there might be more traffic. But the streets were empty, and their car stayed close behind me, too close. My heart pounded as I scanned the road for anyone, anything that could help. Then I saw a pair of headlights coming from the opposite direction. Desperate, I flashed my high beams at the car, hoping it would stop. To my relief, the vehicle slowed and pulled over. As I approached, I realized it was a police cruiser. Thank God. The officer stepped out, and I immediately rolled down my window explaining what was happening. By the time I turned to point out the other car, it was gone. They must have sped off the moment they saw the cop. The officer nodded, clearly taking me seriously, and offered to escort me home. Grateful and still shaken, I followed his car the rest of the way. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I felt a little relief. The officer waited until I was inside before driving off, and for the first time that night, I felt safe. As I locked the front door, I noticed a car going by slowly, with no lights on. My stomach sank as I moved through the house, turning on lights as I went, while continuing to glance out the windows. I noticed the car stopped in front of my neighbor's. There were 2 people inside, and the car looked similar to the one that was following me. My parents had been out with some friends, but a few minutes later they pulled into the driveway. I asked them if they saw the car parked out there. They said yes, but nobody was inside. I told them about what happened, and when we went back to the window to look outside, the car was gone. Either it was a crazy coincidence or they got scared off when my parents pulled in. Nothing else happened after. I was kind of shook to go out at night alone for a little bit after that. When I was a senior in high school, I got my first job at a Blockbuster Video in our small, quiet town. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked the idea of free rentals and a little extra cash in my pocket. The job itself was pretty straightforward. Stock shelves, check out customers, rewind tapes. My first day started like any other, a mix of nerves and excitement as I adjusted to the routine. Around 5 o'clock, a kid from my school walked in. I recognized him from a few of my classes. I think his name was Eddie. He wasn't someone who stood out, average height, thin, and an oversized hoodie. He didn't say anything, just walked around the aisles. At first, I thought he was looking for something to rent, but he kept glancing in my direction. It felt odd, but I brushed it off as nerves from being new on the job. The next day, he came back. Same routine. He didn't rent anything, just wandered the aisles. This time his eyes barely left me. I tried to act like I didn't notice, but the way he stared made me feel exposed, like he was studying me. My coworker joked that I had an admirer, but something about the way he watched me felt creepy. By the 3rd day, it was starting to get under my skin. He showed up again, right after school, and stayed for almost an hour. I couldn't focus on my work with him lurking around. His presence was unsettling. I mentioned it to my boss, who shrugged it off, saying some kids just like to hang out there. On the 4th day, I decided to confront him. When he walked in and did his usual routine, I worked up the courage to approach him. I asked if I could help him find something. He turned to face me for the first time. His eyes were unsettling. He said, "Not unless you want to help plan your funeral." I froze, unsure if I'd heard him right. Before I could respond, he walked out, the bell above the door jingling as it closed behind him. My heart was pounding as I replayed his words over and over. I told my boss immediately, and she didn't hesitate to call the cops. When the officers arrived, I described the kid and told them his name, which I'd overheard in class before. They took it seriously, especially after hearing what he'd said to me. I didn't expect much to come from it, maybe a lecture from the cops and a slap on the wrist for scaring me. But I was wrong. The next day, one of the officers came back to the store to get some more info. He pulled my boss and me aside and told us what they found when they went to the kid's house. In his room, they discovered a notebook filled with names. Mine was at the top of the list. Beside each name, he'd drawn crude sketches of guns and written disturbing notes, many of which mentioned graduation day. The officer wouldn't go into detail, but he said it was enough to warrant immediate action. I'm pretty sure they arrested the kid because he never came back to school after that. There was a lot of talk and rumors that started swirling around school. For a while, life returned to normal. I kept working at Blockbuster, but I couldn't stop thinking about that notebook. What would have happened if we hadn't called the police? I told myself it was over. The kid was in custody, and whatever he'd planned would never come to pass. Weeks went by, and I started to feel safe again, but that is something I'll never forget.